Good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's just about afternoon in Washington. Thank you for joining us once again for another in a series of webinars. I do hope that you are enjoying a good day so far. Today's subject matter, today's topic is one that we found to be of great importance and was certainly requested of us. So I want to make sure that we're focusing on subject matters that are both topical and significant to your continued work in your particular area of service provision. But we're delighted to focus today on the subject matter of practical approaches to addressing hoarding in supported housing. I'm assuming some of you may have had the opportunity or experience of either participating in our Buried in Treasure series or workshop, or for those who are entirely new to hoarding as a subject matter, I want to make sure that you have a sense that today's webinar is really intended to provide practical tools and frameworks to help navigate the challenges of hoarding behaviors in supportive housing settings. And this presentation is primarily intended to provide you with key definitions, intervention strategies, case study, we'll review a case study, and some practical tools for practice. So we hope that it certainly meets your expectations and you have some key takeaways from today's engagement. Um, I would certainly like, if you have the opportunity, if you can just give me a sense of how folks are doing. Tell me, how are you doing in your neck of the woods here in Washington, in the state of Washington? And as you may know, I am stationed here in New Jersey. So I always like to get a sense as to how things are in Washington. And David, I can understand you being hungry at this time, assuming that you can grab something to eat, but absolutely, good day to you all. A little chilly in Washington. Yes, we're having lots of rain here in New Jersey, so we're feeling like a Washington day, I presume. That's phenomenal. Try to stay warm and dry. Absolutely. So let's get right to it. So, welcome, and today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is, like I mentioned, an interactive training, and we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout the session. The slides, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, will be sent by email after the presentation, to look out for that. Um, a note with artificial intelligence. Please note that the use of automated non-taking bots or similar tools during the Washington Foundational Community Supports events or meetings require prior approval. So please ensure that you pay attention to that. And any questions related to that, certainly relate to us, and we'll try to get it to the appropriate folks in Washington Healthcare Authority. Our basic housekeeping, we certainly, by now you should aware, this is a webinar approach. So your audio and video are going to be muted, and you can use the computer audio, or there's a calling information we can provide to you. We ask that you use the chat and make sure that when you're doing so to share information, to ask questions, you have it indicated to the panelists or all attendees so we can share globally. You can download the chat or information in the chat by going to that three dots that says more, and you simply click into that, and you'll get an opportunity to go to the chat next to the area where you have the face, and you can certainly save the entire chat. We strive to make all our material as able for you to be able to get subtitles and other information as accessible as possible. And if there's any questions, please relay that to us. You can certainly click to get show captions, and that information will be available to you. So certainly want to get right into it with an opportunity to look at what our objectives are for today's session. What do we hope that you will take away, you will achieve from today's webinar? So we want to make sure that you have a good working definition of hoarding and get a sense of its impact on supportive housing. We want to make sure that you're able to understand the psychological and behavioral roots of hoarding. What underlies the hoarding behavior, and what really drives that kind of response to the emotions that are associated with hoarding. I want to help you identify strategies for engagement and harm reduction and give you a good sense of what the harm reduction approach is and the potential benefits of taking that approach. And we want to also ultimately explore collaborative client-centered interventions approaches that will help facilitate and empower people to make the desired changes to unclutter and to get back to the optimum functioning. So we hope that that's tangible enough takeaway that certainly informs today's webinar and ensure that you have a meaningful engagement and something substantial to take away. Any questions there? All right. So as we take a conscientious look at what we want to take away, what we're focusing on, I want to start off by getting a sense of your working knowledge of hoarding and its impact on supportive housing. And the best way for me to at least get that kind of baseline information is to post some questions. So I'm going to launch a poll and ask that you provide us some feedback to the poll questions, and that will give us a good sense as to your working knowledge of hoarding. So if you would oblige, I certainly would like to ask if you can respond to the poll, and I'm going to launch that poll. So take a few quick minutes and provide us with this feedback as best as you can, and we'll have a little discussion subsequent to the end of the poll, and we'll see where we are. And certainly let me know if anyone is having any challenges with accessing the polls. So we'll give another minute or two, and we'll take a look at your responses, and we'll have that kind of initial discourse as to what's our collective and individual understanding, so the fundamentals of the concept of hoarding. That's quite all right. I saw a number of folks kind of submit the answer in the chat, but if that's your best way of doing that, let's certainly use what's available to you. But if you can, certainly provide responses directly to the poll, and we go from there. So I'll give another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll end the poll and provide the results, and then have a little discourse. All right, so I'm going to wrap up the poll now, and then we'll certainly get a chance to have a little discussion. So I'll share the results. So poll questions. The first question is, what is hoarding disorder? And there's some options here. And from the choices here, the answer is certainly, and I think most of you had that correct. It's a mental health condition characterized by persistent difficulty discarding possessions and accumulating clutter, regardless of their value. So, and I saw certainly one of the options was a lifestyle choice, and sometimes we can make that mistake or presumption of assuming it's a lifestyle choice, but the correct answer is certainly it is a mental health condition that has some specific characteristics, and it's important for us to be aware that is certainly not a choice quite often. So secondly, what is the primary impact of hoarding on individuals living in supportive housing? And we have the options if it leads to increased social interactions, but the answer is correct. It's B. It can create safety hazards and interfere with daily functioning. So that's certainly the impact that among the choices here that is more accurate. I'm hoping that folks are spot on with that. Which of the following is not a common symptom of hoarding disorder? It's a little tricky one. We intended to really um, have those brain cells working a bit. And the best answer there is, think of it, which of the following is not, and that's important, it's not a common symptom, right? And one of the, certainly the best answer here is feeling of immense satisfaction after discarding items. As we'll discuss further, that is certainly not the response to any thought or plan of discarding items. So it certainly does not result in a feeling of intense satisfaction. So the next question is, which of the following is a common reason for struggling with clutter or hoarding? And certainly it's all of the above. It's a fear of being judged by others, a desire of control or security, a lack of support or resources. They all are common reasons why people struggle with hoarding. And finally, what is the best approach to supporting individuals with hoarding in supportive housing? And we want to make sure that we take that kind of best practice approach, which is to provide individuals with knowledge, skills, and resources to declutter and optimize functioning. So I hope that kind of early tease kind of get things moving, and it appears as though most of you have a good working knowledge of hoarding, so we're in a good place. Any questions there? Anything was startling or anything that was surprise to you in that kind of quick discourse? And someone asked, is Section 8 considered supportive housing? Not generally, because in many cases, people are living independently without services, but there are instances where people have a Section 8 voucher or subsidy and are receiving supported services. So there's not exclusive in that sense. And thank you, Fernandez. You kind of allayed to that as well. So, Carrie, I saw you raise your hand. Is there a particular question? I've seen some questions coming in. Do people report not wanting to clean out their home because then everyone will see that they are a hoarder? That fear of being judged is certainly something that can impact people's willingness to access help. So the answer is it could be yes. Absolutely. Okay. So keep the questions coming, and I will certainly do our very best to get you an immediate response as best as we can. So those are the objectives for today. So what exactly is hoarding? And to no surprise, there's lots of different variations in terms of what people perceive hoarding to be. But in general, hoarding is defined as a pattern of persistent difficulties with discarding personal possessions, even those with no apparent value, because of a strong desire to save and a distress or indecision about what to discard. So it has a lot to do with that personal emotional frame and connection with their possessions. Difficulty discarding is often, but not always, accompanied by excessive acquiring or unneeded objects. So there's lots of variables, both emotional and behavioral, that really lends itself to someone being somehow being categorized as presenting with a hoarding challenge or a cluttering issue. So that's important to note that we speak both of an emotional connection with possessions as well as behaviors that really create distress and functional challenges as it relates to excessive acquiring or collection of possessions. And it often, the functional element of it or the functional impediment um, is oftentimes related to those living spaces that are compromised by the excessive collection of items and the person's distress associated with potentially even thinking of discarding those items. So when we speak of hoarding, we speak to both the behavior, the emotional or sentimental connection to those items, and the distress or functional impairment associated with either discarding those items or making changes to the environment. But to really give a good description or explanation of it, I'm going to resort to the expert who really give a good, clear definition of it, and I hope this helps.
I have to keep everything tidy. I must have OCD, right? Not necessarily. What happens in OCD is
Hoarding disorder is characterized by difficulty parting with possessions, and parting with those possessions causes distress, impairment in individuals' lives. And this distress manifests in clutter that impairs living spaces. So individuals aren't, for example, able to cook in their kitchen or sleep on their beds. And the symptoms of difficulty parting with possessions and clutter aren't otherwise characterized by a comorbid medical problem. So, for example, somebody who has broken their arm and can't physically remove objects from their home, that would not be characterized as hoarding disorder. And similarly, not accounted for by another psychiatric condition. So, for example, individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder may have intrusive thoughts about touching items and fears about contamination. So they may also not be able to remove items from their home, but that wouldn't be characterized as hoarding disorder. Now, hoarding disorder has a prevalence of 2 to 6% in the population, and it's quite impairing for individuals. They have difficulty with, can have impairments in social relationships and work functioning, and that's where it really crosses the line between having an interest and passion for objects and crossing the line into a hoarding disorder.
So I hope that that further explains what hoarding disorder is and how it's both categorized and how it's both clinically diagnosed. So, and we'll take a look at that. So I think what's important to take away from that explanation is that that particular behavior, both the behavior and the emotions associated with it, cannot be somehow explained by another condition. And it leads to significant distress and impairment in functioning. And that's the important caveat that needs to be really taken cognizant of in terms of the distress and impairment and the fact that it can't be explained by another condition. And I've seen a number of instances where folks are talking about specific cases. I have a couple of clients right now who have been informally labeled as hoarders by previous case managers, and I'm not sure they fit that label actually or not, and what do I need to do about it? Essentially, and we'll talk some more about that because we've had a number of instances where people are either, from self-diagnosing to people throwing out diagnosis without a concerted way of approaching it. And then it becomes a label and a stigma. So we have to be very careful with that. Hoarding disorder has to be diagnosed by a professional and someone with that kind of working knowledge and expertise and capacity to make that diagnosis. And I'm glad that that came up because we're going to move next to how do we diagnose hoarding disorder. So essentially, it's a DSM-5 diagnosis, and we use that particular point of reference to diagnose hoarding. And there are some clear indications of how someone arrives at a hoarding disorder diagnosis, and people have to meet certain specific criteria, and that's certainly included there from persistent difficulty discarding items to really some specifiers as well in it, as included there. And in addition to that, it's not merely a matter of looking at the DSM-5 and seeing if people hit those criteria. It's also a multifaceted kind of assessment approach to arrive at the diagnosis. So we have structured interviews for hoarding disorder. So that structured interviews can be done with a person that is complaining or is dealing with those challenges. You have a clutter image rating scale. So you look at this person's specific conditions and environment and really assess it based on some imaging. And the saving inventory revised, so people look at how people perceive their relationship with the items, and as well as a hoarding scale interview. So we scale the person's current presentation and function. Hope that helps in terms of how we arrive at a working diagnosis. So once again, we use a number of instruments and a number of approaches to assess hoarding, from a clutter image rating to structured interviews and to functional assessment, really looking at how that person is functioning in their environment to arrive at a good, solid diagnosis. And one of the instruments used is this cluttered image rating. So here are some photographs of a person who is perceived to have challenges with clutter and how that is used to arrive at a hoarding diagnosis. So here you have the clutter image rating scale, as we call it. It is a tool that helps standardize definitions of clutter by showing a series of images depicting rooms in various stages of clutter. So this allows the client and the clinician or another observer to select the image on the scale that best corresponds with the state of that particular room. And the cluttered image rating scale contains 3 sets of 9 photos to clarify the level of clutter in the kitchen, living room, and the bedroom or other living spaces. And essentially what occurs is that those photos are taken and we rate them on other areas in the house. And generally rooms that rate at, as the picture would stay at number 4, if you see what number 4 looks like, then generally we perceive that there's a probable hoarding problem, and that potentially can help us arrive at the diagnosis for hoarding. So we look at we look at the kitchen, the bedroom, the living room, and basically look at the photos of that environment. And if it's close or aligned or looks very similar to a level of 4 or beyond, we consider that person to potentially have a hoarding problem. And that can lend itself to creating a more working diagnosis. So I hope that helps and makes sense in terms of how we arrive at it. Takes a series of events and interviews and some information gathering to arrive at a solid diagnosis. So we want to look at what types of hoarding there are. And some of it may be familiar to you. And, and that is, I hear that some folks will be like, wow, hold on a minute. I just took a look at those photos, Earl. My place could be at a 3. Well, you're not in a place where you're not yet in a probable hoarding scenario. And Sarah linked that I have a tenant who probably rates at a 7. So we have people at varying places on that scale, and that's very helpful because it really is a collective kind of awareness. So you're not making a diagnosis sans the person, you're making a diagnosis with that person and helping them understand how we arrive at that, both from a pictorial standpoint as well as a functional element. So the types of hoarding, there's a varied number of hoarding types, and oftentimes there's a lot of familiarity with certain presentations, but in essence, there's object hoarding, where, and that's probably the most common type, where people accumulate items regardless of their value, just kind of wanton collection of items, from empty containers to old food, unwearable clothing, and more. And certainly there is animal hoarding, which is oftentimes not is understated or often not seen, but when it is obvious, it's kind of clear. You have a tremendous amount of a series of situations where it's an excessive number of animals, the person is unable to care for them, um, and they may actually oftentimes have dead animals in the homes. So it's really a glaring and obvious sight, but oftentimes it can occur in very subtle ways, and before you know it, a person has 10 cats and 3 dogs, and they're all living in squalor and not being cared for properly. It's compulsive shopping, where someone, basically is unable to control the urge and the triggers that leads to a lot of acquiring. And oftentimes it can lead to financial and other social problems associated with that person wantonly spending to acquire. Food hoarding, sentimental hoarding, where people collect a lot of stuff that they associate some kind of connection with, and oftentimes such as letters and cards and photographs that get to the point where it becomes so substantial they're unable to manage it or even have a sense as to what they have and whether they can use it. Digital hoarding is relatively a new kind of designation, but oftentimes we find folks who struggle with that. It's a type of hoarding where people accumulate and store digital data that serves no purpose. It's just a collection of a lot of information with the presumption that at some point I'm going to use it, but it becomes substantial in that people are buying or purchasing substantial amount of digital space to hold on to items that they can't really attest to having utility in the moment or really being able to make the most of it. Spending a lot of money on digital space that doesn't have immediate utility. And oftentimes people are shocked and surprised when that is deemed a category of hoarding, because they're like, hold on a minute, I just spent 45 or 60 or 70 or $100 on hoarding space, on digital space that I really can't afford, but I feel this compulsion to do it. I'm sorry to hear that, Patrick. Patrick sort of someone that he knows who has 27 cats until intervention was necessary. And obviously there's garbage and trash collection that gets to the point where it becomes both a hygiene risk, a health risk, and a safety risk. So there's a number of hoarding types that is important for us to be familiar with, so we're not looking specifically at one way of hoarding presenting and assuming that's the only thing we have to be concerned about or be observant about. So I'm hoping that lends itself to some clarity around the various ways in which hoarding can present and why we have to be both vigilant and as well as compassionate when we see these presentations. So tell me, what type of hoarding do you encounter the most? What do you see more often in your day-to-day practice and engagement in your supportive housing setting? Miranda says object hoarding, and that's very common. Most times it is a collection of items of that sort. Food hoarding, object hoarding, fair enough. Yes, object and sentimental hoarding is oftentimes the common presentation. And I think the pandemic did not help in that regard. I think it became more obvious. And oftentimes people had a significant struggle with regards to collecting items. Fair enough. So there's stages of hoarding. Now, there's no standard way of doing this in terms of categorizing the stages of hoarding, but there's some working way of doing it to give a good sense of it. There is not a single widely accepted approach, but this is certainly one the scholarly literature has helped us to kind of attest to. So level one is really clutter contained with no safety risk. Level two is really the increase in clutter and minor safety risk. In this instance, you may have someone who may have a few things in the hallway that may impede exit and egress, and it really doesn't have a utility in the moment that the person can say, well, this, I use this particular item frequently or often, but it's just stored there and serves in that purpose. And there's level three where the clutter is affecting functionality and safety, bedrooms, kitchen, other areas that um, are normally designed for activity and utilization is not being utilized in the way intended, but is really serving as a place to collect these items. And oftentimes we find people say, well, I put them in the living room because I want to be able to go sort them and organize them at a later date, but it never gets done. And Felicia speaks about bike parts, right? Yeah, cycle parts and other areas where you have four cycles, two with wheels on, one without a handle. It just does not present in a way that is going to be utilized anytime soon because it's either not fixed or not in its working state. Canvas painting that they created themselves, it may not be unfinished. It may be, a lot of brushes and stuff that is just not utilized in the way. We always say that concept of if it's been there for a year, you haven't used it, then it's clutter. Level 4, level 5 is severe clutter, significant safety risks. So we get from vermins to issues around the integrity of the home in terms of safety and possible code violations and so forth. So this is kind of, like I said, a working stages of hoarding that we use oftentimes to lend itself to a discourse or a concept as to where that person may be in relation to really a significantly impeding circumstance in their daily functioning. So what stage of hoarding do you encounter the most? If you take a look at this particular staging element, what do you think or what do you see presenting the most in your day-to-day engagement with your consumers? Level 3 to 5, okay. So that speaks to presentations that are challenging and really impeding in the daily functioning. So that's significant for us to know in that you're working with people who have a major challenge here and could impede access to services and ongoing engagement and health and safety risk concerns. So it's important for us because to delineate or distinguish clearly between hoarding and collecting. Because oftentimes you'll hear this rationalization or an explanation, particularly from consumers that have some kind of contemplative element about hoarding or sense of hoarding, where they say, I'm not a hoard, I'm collecting stuff, right? I'm going to use this stuff for some show, I'm presenting it to someone, I intend to sell, I intend to do this, but it never changes. It gets, more and more as an impediment. So there's a distinction. Collecting is really more of a purposeful accumulation, right? Collectors typically have a specific focus or theme for their collection. Someone may collect stamps or collect a particular stuff for two different kind of categories. It's selective in these terms of the acquisition. They are more selective about the items they acquire, often prioritizing those items that align with their interests or goals. So a stamp collector will collect stamps, try to organize it, have it displayed, proud of it, want to have people see it in the way it's displayed. It's organized. There's an emotional connection to it that's positive, that is talked about, that is shared, that doesn't bring shame, but more bring a sense of pride. There's no significant impairment in that person's daily functioning, right? It's part of their life, a significant part of their life, but it doesn't impede other elements of their lives. On the other hand, hoarding is really about accumulating stuff and then have difficulty discarding even those that are not doesn't have utility or is not useful. There's an emotional attachment that brings distress and emotional hurt. There's a lack of organization, there's impairment in functioning, and there is that concept that it's so overwhelming that that person can't really conduct their lives in the manner in which they would like, and lots of spaces in that home is not being used in the way intended. So that's the distinction and difference. And oftentimes we're not saying that you should simply denounce that person's overture that they're a collector, but establish to them clearly what's the distinction. A collector has these particular characteristics, and this is the intent and the purpose of collection in the manner in which it presents. And sometimes that can help that person discern clearly that they're not really in a collection mode, even if they think so. So it's not something to use as a tool to discount that person's perception, but to help lend them some clarity to it. And that's an interesting perspective, Grayson. We live in a culture that encourages us to buy things. And that's absolutely, there's a cultural element that contribute to hoarding, right? There is that, we live in a culture of consumerism and collecting stuff. But it's your attachment and emotional connection to those things that really lend itself to whether or not you're doing so purposefully or you have a problem, an impediment. So the prevalence of hoarding is important to note because I think, as mentioned in the video, there's 2 to 6% of the population that are impacted by hoarding or affected by hoarding. 18.5% among supported housing residents. So there's a greater number of folks who live in supported housing who have or reports or presents with a hoarding condition as it relates to the general population. It's more common among older adults for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about some of them. Just about 23% who seek help for eviction intervention oftentimes meet a hoarding criteria. So sometimes we find out when people are coming for support and assistance to prevent eviction, then we find out that there is a hoarding concern there. Unfortunately, 90% recidivism rate is related to hoarding when attempts to intervene are done without mental health treatment. So we have many instances where there's that concept of let's do a clean out, let's hire a clean out crew, let's come in and just knock it out. Essentially what we find is that is a high, tremendously high recidivism rate when that approach is taken without mental health intervention or support services. As we know, hoarding is linked to trauma, anxiety, depression, and other social isolation. It may be a result or it may be oftentimes a causation. And what we know as well is that treatment ambivalence is the norm, not the exception. So it is a challenging and difficult condition to address and mitigate, but it's so substantial in our population that it requires intervention. Very skilled, well thought out intervention. The likelihood of simply shaming or coercing someone into changing their hoarding behavior has not lent itself to great success. So we need to understand what are some of the risk factors. What conditions, what circumstance put people at a higher risk of engaging in hoarding behavior? As we know, hoarding behavior is influenced by complex interplay of factors, right? There's a lot going on. From genetics to brain functioning to personality traits to life experiences that can impact and underline a hoarding presentation. Oftentimes, people with a family history of hoarding can resort to those behavior from conditioning to just a way of dealing with distress. Stressful events in our lives can enhance those risk factors. So we look at mental health conditions as well. Hoarding is often linked to other mental health issues like anxiety, depression, OCD, stressful life events, particularly people who may have experienced a difficult to cope with life events such as the death of a loved one, divorce, or financial crisis can be a significant trigger for hoarding. A history of homelessness or housing instability, individuals that kind of history may be at higher risk for hoarding by simply trying to hold on to items that define them, that may be historic in their lives, and before you know it, it's out of control. What's important to note is there are specific conditions that also can mirror or sometimes lend itself to hoarding. And Prader-Willi syndrome is one of those. It's often associated with hoarding behavior, where the individual may compulsively collect and store items, particularly food, due to their intense and persistent hunger, which is oftentimes a core symptoms of that syndrome. So it's important to recognize that as well. It's probably one of the most prevalent one that is there, that is really outside of the normal presentation of risk factors. But there's a number of risk factors, and I'm assuming a lot of you may be familiar with some of them that's related to hoarding. So it's important for us to have a good understanding as to the psychological roots of hoarding, right? What are the underlying psychological and emotional component of this hoarding disorder? It's complex and multifaceted, and often involve a combination of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral factors. So we think of that kind of sentimental attachment to an item, which is often the presentation, right? People who hoard tend to report that there's a sentimental connection to their possessions, right? They view them as an integral part of their identity, often associated with positive memories or people. I'm holding on to this particular doll because I was given it when I was 13 years old, and my grandmother was the person who gave it to me, and she died, and I was sad when she died. And this is holding on to this reminds me of her, gives me a way of connecting with her, and before you know it, it becomes an overwhelming emotional, sentimental attachment that really doesn't have a functional benefit to that person in the moment, but it's just something that they hold on to. There's a feeling of safety that oftentimes comes with holding on to possessions. They feel comforted when surrounded by their possessions because there's a concept that if I get rid of it, I'm going to lose every connection that that item had in my life. Oftentimes seek control by engaging in hoarding behavior. Oftentimes collecting items wantonly or excessively can be a way for an individual to exert control over their possessions and the environment, right? Because if there's a significant sense of a lack of control in other areas of your life, sometimes holding on to those items and those possessions can be the only way to exert some kind of control in your life. And before you know it, the more you feel a sense of lack of control in other areas, the greater you feel the need to gather possessions to increase that feeling or that perception of control. So sometimes it can be a double-edged sword. Absolutely, Ian. A fear of not being in control or perceived as the only form of control by having those possessions and compulsively collecting them. And sometimes it's a way it's a way of addressing things using that kind of emotional avoidance. It may be a way to avoid or cope with difficult emotions or painful experiences. Just holding on to it. Classic example, a person who may be just had an emotional breakup or a relational breakup and then begins to hold on to every single item that they can put their hands on that related to a positive relationship that they may have had in a way of coping with the one that was just hurtful and distressful. And before you know it, the person have a collection of photograph and every item that was given to them by any friend or any person that they had a positive relationship with, to the point where it becomes excessive. And Stephen relates to had a little growing up, so now we can't get enough. Yes, there's just that feeling of I have to use these tangible ways of reminding myself that I'm lovable, I am valued, and I'm important. And before you know it, it becomes overwhelming. So it's oftentimes paved with good intentions, but it just becomes overwhelming and excessive, and people lose sight of the utility and the purpose of it. So there's other contributing factors, trauma and stress, family history, and I think someone alluded to that earlier, the cultural influence. I give a classic example, and I think of it in that sense. I know a lot of folks like myself who are immigrants who came to this country and oftentimes came from very poor, deprived environments or circumstance, came to America, heard of this great concept of the American dream. You can get things, you can buy things, you may be able to change your life circumstance and be able to collect things and possess things. And before you know it, it's out of control. But every time you buy something and possess something, it's a reminder or reinforcement that you have. And it's farther away you feel from that time when you didn't have. And before you know it, it gets out of control because you start feeling more and more a need to reinforce and to remind and to reassert that sense that you are able to possess things, right? You're not deprived, you're not at that risk factor, but before you know it, it gets out of control. So we've got a number of folks who came from, very deprived circumstance, now able to acquire, and it gets out of control. Absolutely, Damien. People can look at objects like achievements, right? The guy who has 15, 16 cars in his driveway that he's going to fix because one of them was his dream car when he was a child and he lived in a circumstance where he never thought he'd be able to buy it. Now he can, but he buys 4 old ones to put them all together to make one functional one, and he never gets to it. Classic example. So there's lots of theories of hoarding, and some are very common. The psychological ownership theory, which is the feeling that it is mine. I possess it. I have the power. I have that sentimentality to the items that I have, and the possession is viewed as part of that person's identity. There's a constructivist approach, which is the temporary custodians of the items, right? Oftentimes that's related to people who have that sentimental attachment to item. Every single thing that my grandmother and my great-grandmother have that I got passed down through generations, I have to hold on to because I am the purveyor. I am the person who holds, I'm the anthropologist of the entire generation and family. I have to hold on to these things. They have meaning. I'm responsible for having this kind of connection with these things and hold on to them. I'll pass them on to some grandkids or some great grandkids down the road. And before you know it, it gets to the point where I have to have additional room and space. In some instances, people have storage space to collect things. Holding on to memory of loved ones, relief of anxiety, of deprivation. Then there's the attachment theory, right? Replacement of the human relations with objects. You have a tremendous amount of loss, and before you know it, people start holding on to items and objects and having those kinds of connections and relationship with those items to replace those with human relationships that they may have lost or have trouble maintaining. And I'm glad to hear that, Jennifer. You never thought of it that way. But yes, we want you to have a really good psychological understanding as to the underpinnings of this behavior. So you're not associating it merely with the behavior. Lots of underpinnings. So I'm hoping that there's a better understanding as to why and how and what's the causation, what's the underlying emotional stuff associated with hoarding and not just this behavioral component. Because it gives us a more sense of sometimes it's not simply a choice on the part of the person, but it's a really difficult emotional construct that they have to unravel. So what's the impact of hoarding on supported housing? And I'm sure many of these may be very familiar to you. Hoarding can have significant impact on supportive housing by creating unsafe living conditions, potentially leading to eviction due to property damage, fire hazards, unsanitary environments, and disruption to other residents. So it has a tremendous, diverse, very impactful relation to people living in supportive housing. Oftentimes, it can lead to exacerbation of mental health challenges. Hoarding behavior exacerbates, compound already underlying depression or anxiety is concerns and conditions. It often leads to significant strained relationship between participants and staff. So I want you to think for a moment, how does these issues bring FCS staff into conflict with participants? What are some of those conflicts that relate or result from some of the impact of hoarding? And I know oftentimes we hear, the most common one is failed inspections, eviction risk concerns, people dropping out of service because of shame or distress associated with their living conditions. People feeling like they're judged, individuals feeling like they're judged or feel like they're going to be treated differently, and therefore they avoid engagement. People's conditions become more symptomatic as a consequence of having difficulty managing their living environment. And Miranda speaks to the avoidant behavior with staff because when hoarding is trying to be addressed. I don't want you to talk about it. I don't want you to come to my apartment or home and judge me and tell me how things are. If I could manage it, I would. So why do you have to consistently remind me? It's stigmatizing, it's shameful. Absolutely. We talk about oftentimes challenges if the providing agency is the landlord, how do you manage some of the damage or vermin? Or oftentimes one hoarding condition can result in pest infestation across the entire living circumstance, living situation, or whether it's apartment adjoining apartments. Some clients feel like their rights are being taken. Absolutely. Health concerns due to hygiene problems, health concerns. So there's a tremendous amount of challenges around how do you help someone when they may not be fully aware of the level or the degree of their challenges and the risk concerns. Or they may avoid you, or they may be confrontational. Hopefully we get a chance to talk about what that looks like and how you can really work through those concerns or work around it. So, in order for us to even consider mitigating the impacts and promoting positive outcomes, we have to be able to address some challenges in a multifaceted way. So it requires awareness and destigmatization. We have to really be aware of what it is, some of the underlying emotional and behavioral concerns, and be able to go in a really person-centered approach that does not lead to further stigmatization. We have to strive for early interventions and support. We have to work collaboratively and communicate in a really thoughtful, compassionate, empathetic way. We have to develop some individualized service plans associated with that person's particular concern and challenge, focus on safety and well-being, and really engage the community or the supports, the natural supports they have for us to work collaboratively. So it takes a lot. It's not a direct line to really address those concerns. It takes a lot of work and very multifaceted approach to doing it. So it starts with engagement. How do we engage someone who either reports or by observation has major clutter issue or hoarding issue or been diagnosed with hoarding based on what is presenting in their lives, from the distress to the functional challenges? We want to make sure we establish clear expectations and policies, particularly when we're dealing with the supportive housing stuff. What are the policies around inspections, around hygiene, around safety concerns? We have to establish that even when being compassionate about the person's challenge, we have to say there are some policies that can potentially impact your ability to maintain this housing. How do we help you pass inspections and to remain in this house? We want to promote trust and empathy, right? We understand that this is a significant mental health concern and condition that is going to take some time and very skilled approach to supporting and helping you work through it. We want to provide resources and support. If you have people with peer experience who may have gone through it, it's a lot easier to work side by side with those folks when you're dealing with someone who's hoarding. Involve family and friends or people involved in that person's life with their consent. It would not be helpful to approach someone, even if you presume them to be their support staff, if that person is not in agreement or don't see that person as being helpful. We want to balance interventions and approaches with a person's self-determination. So basically, we want to empower that person to understand the challenge, to address the challenge, and then sustain the changes when they arrive at those changes. Because as we know, there's a tremendous amount of recidivism in hoarding. So you have to really get that person to develop those knowledge, skills, and resources to be able not only to address the current situation, but to avoid relapse. And as part of what we do, we want to also ensure that we're advocating for that person's right. The right not just to live in the environment, but the right to have some time and opportunity and support to address the hoarding concerns as they try to work through it. Because the worst thing that can happen is someone after a long period of effort finally begin to think about or to commit to working on it, and then they get evicted. It can throw that person right back to square one. We want to build trust and rapport. It requires a tremendous amount of trust and engagement, mutual engagement to actually make this work. Use respectful verbal and nonverbal communication. And sometimes we find that oftentimes people are saying the right thing but doing the wrong thing. A good example, you may say, or speak to that person in a really respectful, compassionate way, but then in order for you to get in or through, you're pushing stuff out of the way without recognizing that that person may be disturbed by your touching or moving or shifting their items from place to place. It may seem innocuous and insignificant, but to a person who may be challenged with the sentimental connection to that item, simply shifting it from one spot to the next without that person's permission can lead to distress. Does that make sense? And that often happens. I'm glad that it did, because sometimes we can have the right mentality, the right intentions, but sometimes our nonverbal behavior lends itself to a total opposite perception. Absolutely, Jennifer. Using your MI, motivational interviewing skills. You want to assess the person's insight and readiness to change. And we'll talk about readiness to change because you can't move someone to action until they are ready to do so. Focus on the goals, not just the clutter. If the person's goal and you and them arrive at that idea that they want to be able to resume the social interaction by being able to use their living room in the manner in which it was intended and which they preferred in the past, it's a little easier to establish a goal of using the living room to entertain friends than to simply say the living room needs to be free of clutter. Even though it's the same thing conceptually, the manner in which people are pursuing it and what the goal is speaks loudly to their motivation. I hope that helps in terms of building that trust. It's about aiming for functional optimism, for optimizing functioning as well, as opposed to simply looking at We want you to stop doing this. Instead of stop doing this, it's about arriving at the goal to enjoy doing this, if that makes sense. It's about helping that person see how hoarding is impacting their daily functioning and how they want to live their life autonomously and with an opportunity to enjoy their life, as opposed to simply saying, we need you to change this bad behavior to good behavior. Effective communication strategies are essential to supporting and helping someone address hoarding behaviors. You want to make sure you're using I statements and reflective listening. I hear you say, I've observed this, and give the person a chance to either clarify, correct, or affirm what you observe. Validate the client's feeling. These items were important to me and I can't throw them away, so you have to understand how I'm feeling. What I hear you say is that you're feeling that you value these items and you're also overwhelmed by the number of items that you have. Use your ORs, open-ended questions, so you invite discourse and invite a dialogue and invite that person to explain why and how. Use affirmation when the person makes positive strides or steps, or even use change language. Focus on impact. How does this particular behavior accumulation impact your ability to stay in this house or to live in a certain way? Focus on the client's needs and safety. Avoid criticism or forcing immediate change. Very critical. The person is only going to change when they are ready to do so. Engage with empathy and compassion. Listen actively and without interruption, even if that person is repeating the same thing. Give them some grace. Express your genuine concern for the person's well-being. Offer support instead of criticism. I'm here to support you in your effort to regain control over your home so you can live in it in the way you did. I see you have a photo here of a family gathering that occurred right in this home, and you said that you want to get back to this place. How can I help you and support you in doing that? So there's lots of challenges when you're trying to help and support someone who's hoarding. Oftentimes there's a lack of insight or denial about the circumstances, right? I'm not hoarder. These are not a lot of stuff. Why are you judging my collection? There's lots of ways that is presented. People sometimes overvalue their beliefs or emotional attachment to the items. If I don't keep my grandmother's purse that she had stuff, I will not have any memory of her, or I will lose a sense of connection. She's the only family I've had, ongoing and ongoing. There's social stigma and shame that sometimes prevent that person from even thinking about engaging in service to address the concerns, because they don't want to feel judged or undervalued by the person who is even trying to support them. So we have a great deal of varied roles that ultimately can support someone and help them in addressing their hoarding conditions. And we want to build trust and rapport and education. We want to make sure we are aware of the challenges. We want to make sure we can help that person develop an individualized plan. We want to do safety checks and risk mitigation with that person. And we want to, as best as we can, help that person access natural supports to help them manage their conditions. Because at some point we have to understand clearly we're going to have to exit right, and that person is going to have to sustain and try to avoid relapse. So it takes more than simply helping that person manage it in the moment. It's how do they sustain those behaviors to prevent clutter, future cluttering. We want to be able to take a trauma-informed perspective. We want to emphasize safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, and personal choice, even if it's challenging. If that person wants to work 15 minutes, 3 days a week on decluttering, we start there. We don't automatically say to that person, well, you're never going to get, beyond this mountain if you just do 30 minutes at a time. We want to start where that person is and help kind of build some momentum. We want to recognize that changes are gradual and challenging because we're dealing with both a behavior and sometimes a very solid foundation of emotional attachment and sentimentality that takes a long time to kind of unravel. We want to recognize, as we did earlier, that hoarding sometimes serves as a coping mechanism for that person. So unless we can help that person replace that with a meaningful, useful coping mechanism, that may be their default. We want to make sure we're tailoring interventions to the individual's needs and pace at which they are willing to work. We want to make sure that when we look at things from the stages of change, we are not trying to push the person into action when they're simply in preparation mode. We want to take a harm reduction approach when that presents itself. And oftentimes, it is probably the first intervention or approach that people allow. And how do we do that? We have to first understand what is the approach with harm reduction. Harm reduction is intended and should focus on minimizing risk and improving safety rather than forcing immediate or quick decluttering or altering the hoarding behaviors. So once we step into that forum, we want to make sure, listen, Gloria, Anne, James, whomever that individual is, that participant is, our major initial goal here is to make sure that you're safe, you can potentially maintain this housing, and as we do so, we'll consider working on how do we help you declutter so that you're able to resume utilizing your space in the way intended. But we want to start first by reducing the risk of harm, ensuring that safety is paramount, and that we maintain your ability to remain in this house legally. So we want to identify risk and prioritize safety. What is the immediate risk concerns? Fire safety, egress, health and safety, mental health stability. We want to develop a harm reduction plan that focuses on incremental change. Your priorities to ensure your kitchen, your living room, and your bedroom have an egress and have a way for you to be able to sleep, live, exist, cook, and so forth, primarily. And Stevie says we have empowered her with offering her to clear items within a time frame by providing her with a tilt cart to dispose items she knows she needs. Yes, you have to start where that person can see some tangible results early and have a sense that it's about addressing their safety and their wellness in the interim. We want to implement the plan, addressing psychological and social needs. So it's not just about addressing the behavior. It's about helping that person become aware and also begin to address the underlying emotional concerns that are resulting in the behavior. Are they using hoarding as a way of coping with other underlying emotional issues that they're not addressing? We want to tackle those. The person has a significant loss of a loved one and the hoarding behavior commences. We want to make sure that we're not overlooking that grief and loss that is not being addressed and just focusing on the hoarding behavior. because then we're just addressing the symptoms and not the disease. We want to evaluate and adapt as we go along, as we continue to work, regularly assessing effectiveness and adapt. If this particular strategy is working for 2 weeks and then it stops, we want to be able to revisit that, find out why, and shift and pivot as things change. Because oftentimes what we find is even when people begin to make some incremental progress, they can get scared or become overwhelmed or fearful. Because remember, if someone is discarding and giving up their prized possession as they see it, there can be a period of loss that they have to address, even when it's discarding items. Absolutely, Kim. The mental health of the residents is top priority, as well as physical health and psychological safety. So there's lots of ways of introducing harm reduction planning quickly. So we can look at some simple items like removing items that block exits or paths or create fire hazards. How do we do that? We want to ensure access to food, water, and necessity. How do we make sure that your refrigerator is not blocked? You're able to do so. You're able to clean it out. You're able to get from the refrigerator to the sink to the stove. Sometimes we have to work with folks to reconfigure possessions to create safer pathways. Instead of saying we need to get all of this out of the living room, maybe shift it so that there's a pathway, and then begin to work incrementally on making that pathway a little wider and more accessible. We want to help that person sometimes develop strategies and ways to organize and discard items. You don't necessarily think you're going to put up a dump truck at their door and simply say, push out everything. It's a gradual, thoughtful, compassionate, predictable way of doing it. So here are some guidelines as to how we can help that person plan around harm reduction, how to make things safe. Keep clutter out of paths. You can use marking tape to windows, hallway, and front and back. So there's lots of approaches to doing so. What are the benefits of harm reduction approach? We reduce the risk of harm, we increase safety, and oftentimes it can immediately improve engagement and connection with that person. The person feels less at risk of losing their home, or less at risk of the fire, less at risk of a fall risk. It's a good place to start and build some momentum. So we can actually engage in future or long-term or sustained interventions. And it can reduce the sense of stigma. Too early, and we're going to look at quickly, how do we ensure that the interventions and the approaches and the strategies we take are in alignment with that person's stage of change? For those of you who may have had our FCS training or any training, we talk a lot about the stages of change and how intervention should match the stages. So when we speak to someone who may be in pre-contemplation, which is oftentimes the initial kind of presentation that the person have when we discover that they have a hoarding problem, we often get folks who are denying they have a problem or minimizing the impact. The best way to address that is to focus on increasing awareness and motivation. Using that clutter scale, which gives us a pictorial, a picture definition of where that person is. Here is what a hoarding condition at level 4 looks like. Here is what your living room looks like. Give me your perception of how you see that. And the person may be able for the first time to say, wow, I didn't think of it that way. But if that's what level 4 hoarding is, and that's my room, I can see why you perceive me to have a significant problem. Absolutely, the checklist will be provided to you. So the intervention is to provide information about hoarding, help educate that person about hoarding disorder, the impact of hoarding, and the challenges associated with it. If the person is in contemplation, okay, I heard you, it makes sense. I'm aware of the problem. I want to consider change, but I'm not ready to act yet, right? I'm aware, but I'm not ready to act. You want to explore the pros and cons of changing. And what kind of ambivalence is in place? Is that person having those second thoughts or uncertain about what they can do and what the benefits are? How do you help that person build that kind of self-efficacy to move from that sense of, yes, I think I have a problem, but I need to take action? You go from preparation to action. If the person is in action, actively wanting to make the change, they're ready to get moving. You want to make sure you jump on that opportunity. You want to provide support. Here are the people that are going to work with you over, and you establish clearly, we're going to come here 3 times a week. We're going to start working on these areas. You want to provide encouragement as the person begin to work, even if they have challenges. Keep them motivated. You want to discuss and put in place some strategies for overcoming challenges and maintaining momentum. Typically, when people are working on hoarding, when they get to the point where they have to move significant items, they oftentimes can have trepidation or fear. Here's what we have seen help people who have these concerns. Here's where you can go to. And ultimately, we want to get people to maintenance where they're celebrating. They've done the work. They've put in a lot of the work. They can see the spaces. They have access to those spaces. They're living their life meaningfully. We want to help them sustain. How do you prevent yourself from going back to that default behavior when you encounter trauma or stress? Here are some ways of addressing stress, addressing trauma without resorting to hoarding. So the stages of change in alignment with the interventions are critical and important because we always want to work at the pace the person is working with and in alignment with where that person is in terms of this stage of change. So we want to quickly look at a case and give you some feedback as to how we intervene and what are some of the recommended strategies. So we want to look at Marilyn. She's 62 years old. She lives alone in a 1-bedroom apartment within a supported housing program. Marilyn has a history of anxiety and mild depression. She worked as a school librarian for 30 years and reports always valuing books, paper goods, and sentimental items. Over the last 5 to 7 years, her collecting has intensified. The presenting problem is staff observed that Marilyn's apartment is cluttered with books, newspapers, cardboard boxes, and bags of items she finds on sale or free. The kitchen is barely usable, and there's only a narrow walking path from the door to the bathroom and bedroom. Pest control was unable to treat her unit due to blocked access. Marilyn acknowledged the clutter, but insists everything is important and she plans to organize it soon. Sounds familiar? I'm absolutely sure it sounds familiar to you. So what are some of the key challenges here for Marilyn? She seemed to have limited insight and high emotional attachment on the items. Her health and safety concerns are at risk. She has blocked kitchens and exits, which means she probably can't actually exit if there's a fire. There's a tremendous amount of anxiety that is triggered by the discarding. The idea of removing her stuff is distressing to her. She's resistant to outside help due to fear of judgment. She doesn't want to be judged based on what people see her apartment as being. So what are some of the strategies we can use to help Marilyn? Let's look at them. So we can take a harm reduction approach. Rather than insisting on cleanouts, staff will collaborate with Marlene to identify high-risk areas. Egress, exits, stove, exits, to prioritize for immediate attention. Hey, Marlene, obviously we understand the challenge with really organizing and discarding your stuff, but right now you present with some significant health and safety concerns. You have to be able to get out of fire. If there's a fire, you have to be able to evacuate. You talk about wanting to make sure that you can eat healthy, get to your stove. You want to be able to get your rest. You want to be able to access your bedroom and be able to do so. Let's look at some of those priority items to reduce the harm. We don't want to focus on how do we get your house spick and span. We want to get it to a place where you're safe. We use some motivational interviewing approaches. A case manager can use reflective listening. And our affirmations to explore Marlene's ambivalence. Why are you uncertain about even attempting to do this? What are you struggling with? What are the thoughts that are keeping you stagnant? And we want to make sure that you're aware that you can actually address these concerns at your own pace. We want to set small goals, achievable goals, such as clearing one counter or sorting one box per week, aligned with Marlene's comfort level. We want to give her some visual cues and supports. Create a clean and safe checklist with photos of safe environments to help Marlene visualize goals. So if there's an area which is clear and stuff, we take a photo of that and say, Marlene, we want to make sure that your bedroom is similar to what you use and what you enjoy in your living room. We want to know quickly that we need to get some help to help her address those underlying psychological challenges, right? You link her to her therapists with training in hoarding disorder and arrange for peer support from someone with lived experience who can say to Marlene, listen, I was there. This is what it feel like and look like. And then before you know it, everything was out of control. You don't want to wait until that happens. You want to use positive reinforcement, recognize and praise incremental progress to encourage ongoing engagement and build self-efficacy. Marlene, you did a phenomenal job of clearing out that counter before we came so we can cook. That's a great, great achievement. I'm very proud of you. Want to develop a plan with Marlene in case the clutter causes an emergency and empower her with choices even under pressure. If you're unable to do this by yourself, whom can we seek support from to help you move a few things so that you can get in and out of your apartment safely? What other strategy do you think we can recommend for a person like Marlene? Or you may have used in a person who presents similar to Marlene? Absolutely. The slides and the recording will be available to you subsequent to the training. So Marlene may be able to benefit as well from some particular coping mechanism, right? Fantastic, Cecilia. Let's start small and work our way up. I love that. It's a great way of putting it. And Kim speaks to something very specific. I would meet the client outside of the environment. And sometimes that's important. If the person is not comfortable with you coming into their home immediately, you may want to meet with them and have them give you kind of a description or even ask them to take a photo of it and bring it to you and you'll be able to start the discourse there. So that's a good example. I want to move beyond that. One of the ways of helping people build goals and develop goals is to help them find their own motivation for resolving hoarding behaviors. We want to, instead of saying the goal is for you to, not hoard or to be able to have this space, the goal is to help you understand why you hoard or to create a living space you can use or find your possessions, your valued possessions quickly when you need it. So it must be organized and in a good place. We want to help you reacquire or reduce acquiring and enjoy other activities. As opposed to feeling distressed and compelled to go to every single garage sale, we want to make sure that you have activities that you like and you engage in that doesn't result in that being your default social activity. And ultimately, we want to maintain your health and safety and your mental health by having you exist in an environment that you can actually use in the manner intended. So when we speak of developing individualized service plans for hoarding, we want to make sure we're tackling some specific things. We want to recognize that each person's hoarding challenge is unique and subsequently interventions has to be tailored to that person. We want to help that person by employing cognitive behavioral techniques to help identify and challenge negative beliefs and behaviors associated with hoarding. Because oftentimes there's a litany of really negative thinking about things, right? We want to be able to use the catch it, check it, change it approach. You want to catch that negative thinking. We want to be able to check it to clarify whether or not what we believe is true, and then we want to be able to change it in a meaningful manner. We want to ensure that we're using practical supports. We want to make sure we're trauma oriented in our approach, harm reduction in our approach. We want to build skills not just to declutter, but to help those people manage those emotional challenges and the triggers and the urges that come. So we build skills, we look at cognitive skills, organizational skills, and behavioral skills. From identifying and challenges those negative thoughts that result in hoarding, to creating a system for organizing our possessions, to setting small goals to address clutter. So there's lots of practical strategies for beating hoarding. We reduce acquiring by looking at some significant reasons why we acquire. We want to change our thoughts about acquiring. We want to develop alternative sources of coping and enjoyment so they're not resulting in just gathering stuff to make that happen. We want to make sure that if we're ready in action and we're ready to take steps, we have a clear and definitive strategy of doing so. We want to establish if we have a time where we're going to organize and discard stuff. We have boxes or containers that we put things that we're going to keep, things we're not sure of, and things we're going to give away. We want to limit the amount of categories so we're not overthinking about how we organize our space. We want to sort and organize for a targeted time each week, and we want to build in rewards when we've done the work. So classic examples, if a person is ready and willing to engage in sorting and organizing their stuff and discarding stuff, we have things in a space, in a particular place that they can take their items to, put it in the box for keeping, put it in the box for discarding, putting recycling stuff in recycle, and take it out immediately. It's a big step. If you're going to discard stuff or you're going to recycle stuff, you put it in the bag, you put it in the container, you put it out. Because in many instances, if it's only put in a bag in the home, what happens more often than not, even after people organize stuff for discarding? If those stuff are still kept in the home, what happens? It stays there, absolutely. Or people go back into it and start pulling out stuff saying, I shouldn't have put this away, right? I don't know what I'm going to do without this. Exactly, they put items back. So you want to make sure that when you're discarding, you immediately organize it, you put it where it needs to be, and you put it out. We often talked about putting the stuff you're going to discard in the trash bin and put it out for pickup. If trash is picked up on Wednesday, you want to be able to sort and discard Tuesday night. So it's timely, it's quick, and it happens immediately. People don't get a chance to have those second thoughts. Don't give yourself the chance to change your mind. Absolutely. So we can look at some tips for housing inspection to make sure that people have safety in that regard. We have some safety plans that are clear. We want to clear pathways. We want to make sure we're adhering to fire safety protocols. We want to clear space to prevent falls. And we want to make sure that we are reducing the risk of pest infestations. And there's some clear and definitive ways of doing that. Hoarding interventions in general can be very varied. It requires a collective team. So we want professional support. We want to learn cognitive behavior strategies. We want to make sure that we're giving people a chance to use some exposure and response prevention approaches. We use our motivational interviewing techniques. We're gradually decluttering. We're using harm reduction. We're educating family and support system to help support that person in making those change. And we want to advocate so that people are not stymied by stigma attached to it. What we know for a fact is that hoarding can only be effectively abated and sustained when a multidisciplinary team approach is taken. We want to have collaboration with property managers, the clinicians, peer workers, pest control, all the people involved in that person's life, so we're all working on the same accord. So there's legal and ethical considerations. We want to make sure that the property rights is respected. We want to make sure health and safety is focused on. The person's autonomy is sustained and developed and respected. And we want to look at eviction potentially and guardianship rights if that's happening. If things are out of control and the person is not mentally stable to manage the circumstance, we want to get as much support as we can. As staff, we want to make sure you're avoiding burnout as well. Set your boundaries, set your expectations, prioritize your self-care, and seek professional help if you need it. Hoarding can be extremely, extremely demanding and challenging on staff. So we want to make sure you're taking care of yourself while you're supporting people. So I know we are just a minute outside of our time. I certainly open the floor for questions. And I would ask as well, while you're considering those questions, that you take a moment and complete the evaluation to inform our future trainings. Absolutely, Cecilia, thank you. And someone asked if there's any tips on helping a client. Make sure I have that question. And thank you all. And remember, the slides and the recording will be available to you. So please know that that will be it. I want to thank you. We appreciate your time and attention and participation. Today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. We'd like to remind you that the slides and a link to the recording of this session with a wealth of other resources will be available in the follow-up email. Don't forget to check out Foundational Community Supports newsletter on all things FCS and upcoming training events. And if you'd like to become an FCS provider, the information and contact information is available to you. And here are some resources that can further inform you as to approaches and strategies for hoarding, from buried in treasures to treatment for hoarding disorders, and hoarding disorders, a comprehensive clinical guide. As always, we have resources available to you as well that should come in a PDF. But I want to thank you sincerely. It's been, as usual, a phenomenal experience training with folks in Washington. And I hope that you had some substantial takeaway from today's training and that you can continue to do the great work you're doing. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.